My name is Charles Epting, and you're listening to the Lost Labels podcast. The band Model Citizens was only around for approximately 1 year. Their entire discography consists of one EP with 4 tracks, clocking in at approximately 11 minutes total. But that being said, despite their short lifespan and lack of a body of work, I think that it's undeniable the mark that Model Citizens left on the New York musical scene in the late 1970s. They were signed to Spy Records, which was John Cale's record label. John Cale-produced their EP. They played shows with everyone from James Chance to Suicide to Mr. Cale himself. And I think that the influence of Model Citizens is much larger than their lone EP might suggest. I discovered the Shift the Blame EP while digging through a box of 7 inches at a record store in Greenwich Village. The album artwork grabbed me immediately. It captivated me. I had never seen it before. I had never heard of it before. I did not know what it was. But I flipped it over and saw that it was produced by John Cale, and I thought, given his track record, both solo and with the Velvets, it was worth giving a shot. If he endorsed it, if he put his name on it, there must be something to it. So I bought it, having never heard it. I checked Apple Music. It was not on Apple Music or Spotify. So it was a real surprise to me when I got home, put it on my turntable, and dropped the needle. This was the first time I'd ever heard Model Citizens, and I was immediately captivated and fascinated by what I was hearing. I was fortunate enough to speak with 2 of the original Model Citizens, Eugenie Diserio and Stephen Alexander. So this interview is going to be split up over 2 parts, Stephen in the first half, Eugenie in the second half. In this first part, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the history of Spy Records and the very few releases that were ever put out by the label. And then in the second part, before I speak to Eugenie, I'll go into a little bit of history about Model Citizens themselves. Spy Records was founded in 1977 by John Cale and Jane Friedman, his partner at the time, who was also the manager of Patti Smith. The idea was that all the records released on Spy Records were to be produced by John Cale. Interestingly, the Spy Records logo was designed by Michel Esteban, who John Cale introduced to Michael Zilka. The 2 of them went on to found Z Records the following year, Esteban and Zilka. So Spy Records can almost be viewed as the forerunner to that great label. Spy Records released so little music that we can run through their entire discography right now. Spy 1 was a single Busted Chevrolet by Harry Toledo and the Rockets. Spy 2 was You Can Borrow My Car by The Necessaries. Spy 3 was Lester Bangs taking a stab at music with the Let It Blurt single. Spy 4 was the Model Citizens EP, which we'll be talking about today. Spy 5 is by Marie et les Garçons, Marie and the Boys, which was actually a re-release of a single on Rebel Records in France. There was no Spy 6, and Spy 7 was the Mercenary single by John Cale himself. The only full-length released by Spy Records was John Cale's Sabotage live album, from which Mercenaries was taken. So that's it for Spy Records. 6 singles, 1 full-length, none of which are particularly well-known, but all of which share a certain sonic quality in that they were produced by John Cale. I think it makes for a nice little collection of records to listen to back-to-back, because despite the variances in genre or style, again, they all have that same production that is a nice consistency across the board. So without much else to say about Spy Records, we are going to jump right into talking with Stephen Alexander, who was one of the guitarists, percussionists, organ players, singers, sort of a jack of all trades in Model Citizens. Stephen, to kick things off, I just discovered this EP several months ago, but it feels like something that I've been listening to for years. I hear early Television, I hear early Talking Heads, I hear early Blondie.
Well, it's interesting because, there are a number of sort of histories of that period written in various places, and, the Model Citizens don't always get included in that. So it's nice that the record's still out there somewhere and people are able to discover it occasionally, so that's good.
As was the case with the rest of Spy Records' small output, the Model Citizens EP was produced by John Cale. What was it like to work with John Cale on this release?
Well, he was, it was great, of course, working with him, and very interesting to be in the room with him and watch him work. He basically just made we basically just recorded live, and so he set everything up so that it was as close as possible to just sort of like a one shot recording. Although we did a number of takes of each cut, but there wasn't a lot of overdubbing. A little bit. He overdubbed a few little things at the end, and so although the record doesn't have the kind of I would say sort of density of the live sound, it is definitely a very clear kind of capture of what we sounded like. So he just kind of went about it in a real direct way, nothing fancy. The engineer was Kurt Moncasey, who worked with Philip Glass, was Philip Glass's engineer. And so, we were kind of, I think he was going for kind of like a real clear, sort of clean sound, which is, for the most part, what he got there.
Having watched what few videos are available and having read contemporary reports from concerts, it seems like, as great as the EP may have been, going to a Model Citizens concert really was the best, if not the only way, to fully understand the Model Citizens experience.
Yeah, I would say that's very true. I mean, the record is just barely, just barely scratching the surface of what we were doing. And actually the record was made fairly early in the group's development, which was only about a year. The whole duration of the band was about a year, but I would say that the live presentation was really much more raucous and much denser and more polyrhythmic than anything that's on the record. And toward the end of the life of the band, we were doing more sort of extended instrumental things where, I don't know, it was getting pretty interesting, and very repetitive, but also very dissonant and dense. So, it was kind of cool stuff.
When I listen to the Model Citizens EP, I hear a little bit of a lot of things. There's some of the discordance of early television. There's some of the Midwestern influence, bands like Devo that were coming down to New York. It really seems like Model Citizens was a synthesis of everything that was going on in the New York City clubs in the late 1970s.
Yeah, especially on the record. And, I think there was more, it was just so much more complex than most of the stuff that was going on with, even with the Contortions. But I mean, the Contortions were a great band. We played a couple of shows together with them. I think the last Model Citizen show was a double bill with the Contortions at Max's. But I don't know. I would say all those people you mentioned were really certainly strong influences, and Per Ubu maybe was one as well. The record, I think the first actual album, maybe the second album, I can't remember, but it was called Modern Dance, and that was a really one of those records that we listened to over and over, and really were interested in the combination of rhythm and dissonance that was happening with Per Ubu.
What strikes me, though, is that despite how frenetic or crazed the music might sound, there's really good rock songs buried beneath all of the craziness, beneath the marimbas. That's very listenable, very accessible music that sort of has this no-wave shell over it.
Oh, well, that's great. I'm glad that it still holds up in that way. I mean, a lot of the no-wave stuff you would certainly not consider particularly listenable. I mean, even as great as Lydia Lunch was and things like that, it's like it's an experience. It's a kind of performance experience, but it's not exactly a something you put on to listen to in the room.
The four core members of the band, yourself included, were art students at Columbia when you met. How did this whole project even come together in the first place?
We basically approached this thing. I mean, the thing began as basically a sort of performance art project, and because of the state of the scene at that moment, when there was a lot of sort of cross fertilization between the art world and the music scene at the moment. Once we got into the process of doing this thing, it very quickly became a music project, even though we really didn't approach it that way in the first place. And so it very quickly sort of took on a life of its own, and became, something that we were kind of just sort of watching it happen and going along with it, But it was interesting that way because the response to Model Citizens was like immediate and huge, and then it just kind of from that point we very quickly made this record with John, and then after that it was like all this, the major labels and stuff were interested in all that, and so it kind of very quickly got to the point where we were realizing it was turning into something we did not have in mind at all, and certainly didn't necessarily want to continue to do for many years, like sign some sort of long-term contract. But anyway, that's an interesting sidebar to the whole thing.
When you talk about the intersection of sort of performance art piece and rock band, I can't help but think of Andy Warhol's scene in The Exploding Plastic Inevitable. Was that much of an influence on you guys?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the whole kind of mood of that moment was a Warhol moment. The whole sort of do-it-yourself aesthetic, and the fact that you didn't really have to know how to play your instrument to get up there and make some significant noise, was a really Warholian, attitude. So, yeah, Andy was present. He was definitely present.
When you look at the credits on the EP, you played 12-string guitar, marimba, organ, and sang. Eugenie played violin, organ, and sang. Tomek played guitar. Gloria played marimba and sang. It seems like it was a very democratic, all-hands-on-deck approach to recording an album.
It sort of was in the sense that, I mean, we really approached it in that way where everybody just kind of did with every song that was presented, and we all kind of were involved in writing the songs. Some wrote more than others, but usually what would happen was some riff would be presented, and the four of us would get together and create, a sonic, tableau or something, and everyone would just be playing what they felt that needed at the moment. So there were times when, Tomek, Lamprecht, and I had a little bit more musical experience than the others, and so could sort of, Tomek could actually play like, Chuck Berry riffs and stuff like that. and I was able to kind of pick my way around on other instruments. So, there wasn't a lot of actual music going on. It was more like sound, So we just sort of played instruments that we felt were needed in the overall sound of each piece,
Sonically, one of the things that I think separates Model Citizens from most everything else being produced in New York at this time is the marimba, which you played on Shift the Blame. Not really an instrument you would expect from a punk or a post-punk band, and I think that your playing really helps make this EP jump out.
Well, thanks. And but that was Gloria Richards' sort of chosen instrument for the band. She was a big Zappa fan, and she, when we decided to do this thing, it was like, okay, what's everybody going to play? Gloria decided she would play the marimba, and so that was pretty much her. When we played live, she basically played marimba on just about every song, except for the ones that she just sang. And the marimba created all kinds of issues about how to mic it and make it, so that it could be heard over the rest of the instruments and stuff like that. But it was a really distinct instrument, not the kind of thing you see at CBGBs very often.
Model Citizens existed at a time when you had everything from the very straightforward punk rock of the Heartbreakers and the Dead Boys to the more artistic rock of the Talking Heads. What was it like being surrounded by so many different sounds in this scene?
Well, I think the music all was very, very personal to each group, but there was a there was a very there's a shared energy, that everybody was really into it, because this thing was it was really exciting. I mean, it was a moment when there were lots of bands and lots of people creating things that no one had ever heard before, and a lot of different versions of the kind of sort of iconoclastic energy that was going on, So, I mean, I think the best of what was going on at that time it still really holds up as original, being very inventive, everyone. I mean, I think the central idea for everybody was that if they played something that felt like they'd heard it before, that it just got thrown out, and they went for something they'd never heard before,
Looking back, are there any specific Model Citizens concerts that stand out to you? Any bands that you shared a bill with? In terms of playing live, what is it that stands out in your memory so many years later?
Well, we did several shows with Contortions. We did a number of things with Suicide, and we ended up getting paired with Suicide pretty often, I think. We did two of the most memorable shows we did were not in the clubs, but one was at Carnegie Hall. We were part of what was called the first concert of the 80s, which was a big benefit concert for WKCR radio at Columbia University. And on the bill was Model Citizens, but also Philip Glass, Steve Reich, John Cale, David Bowie was there playing with Cale, and it was an all-day concert. It was sold out. It was just an amazing event, and so that was a great. That was where the guy from Bob Krasnow from Warner Brothers Records saw us for the first time, and got on the case at that point. But the other really interesting show that we did was at the Cotton Club in Harlem. We sort of took over the club for an evening, sent out all these invitations, and so it was Model Citizens at the Cotton Club, and it was, again, really a lot of people showed up, and it was a really sort of special event that was kind of fun to do.
You were courted by Warner Brothers, but a full-length Model Citizens LP never came to fruition. What would that LP have sounded like, and was there much discussion within the band about a full-length?
We had lots of songs, and we had a lot of demos, and I have no idea where those are now. We kind of split up before it really got to the point, but we were, at the point that we kind of called it quits. I think it was either we had to really make a commitment to this thing, and we were ready to make an album at that point, or we just go on and do the other things that we wanted to do, which is what we chose to do. But I I don't know. It's hard to remember now. A lot of the songs, but we had we had certainly worked it to a point where there was a very, I'd say, a really distinct identity in the music, and we were doing some things that were pretty interesting. But it's just a very short-lived little moment.
The song Animal Instincts was included on the Great New York Single Scene cassette, which was released in 1982, which put you guys alongside Patti Smith in television, as well as Nervous Rex and US Ape and the Speedies. Already in 1982, you guys were being enshrined amongst the great underground New York acts, I would say.
It's interesting because, and I think musically it fits great there. One of the things about Model Citizens was that I think within that scene of that moment, we were probably regarded a little bit as outsiders because we were all coming from the visual arts. We had MFAs from Columbia and stuff like that. It was just like a bit of an antithesis, which is part of what our whole identity was built on. It's like we would go on stage wearing business suits and it was like theater in a way, but in a certain way we were kind of doing a parody of the scene, and maybe that's why we were possibly regarded as outsiders by a lot of people. But I don't know. But it's hard to look back and really get a clear picture of what was really going on back then, because it's been rewritten so many times.
Your next project after Model Citizens was The Dance. Can you compare and contrast the two projects musically?
I think what happened with The Dance was it became a sort of multiracial band that was really exploring a kind of a funkier approach to rhythm, and it was not nearly as, I'd say, experimental as Model Citizens. Much more accessible.
It was also around this time that you released an album with a young girl named Chandra. How did that project come around?
That is a record that is still in circulation, and we still get, licensing, deals from it and things like that. So, we're still, Eugenie and I are still in touch in the sense that we are still dealing with some of that old business, the stuff that won't go away. But it's pretty amazing that this little project we did with this young girl in 1980 is still out there. And now Chandra is in her 40s, I guess, and she's put a band together and she's out there touring, and actually playing some of those songs that we made back then, as well as some newer things as well. So it's kind of an interesting project in that way.
It's funny that album that you probably didn't think much of at the time has taken on a life of its own and is still going strong today.
Yeah, it really did, and amazingly, because it was truly an obscure cult record. But again, one of those things that got so much attention when it first happened. It was like, oh my God, what are we going to do here? This is like taking off. And then Chandra, who was only like 12 years old, decided to, just go back to school, and she didn't want to do it anymore. So that was the end of that.
You were studying art at Columbia around the time Model Citizens was founded, and you're still an artist today. Can you talk a little bit about your career these days?
Well, I'm a painter, and I have been for, always. And that, the music sort of interlude was maybe about a 8-year, time when I was really focused on music, but still painting. But then it was very easy to kind of ease back into, visual art being my primary focus. And so I make paintings and I show in galleries, and I have taught for a number of years, although I don't now. But I taught at the any university for quite a few years, and so that's just it's a very different, very solitary, focused kind of way of going about making work, as opposed to the collaborative, collaborative process of being in a band and making music in that way, which was always great and always also a little frustrating, but it's, I mean, as a painter, you're also collaborating with other people, with dealers and things like that, but the actual making of the work is a very solitary and focused thing, which I kind of prefer.
I'd like to thank Stephen again for speaking to us. That concludes part 1 of our Model Citizens interview. Part 2, we're going to speak to Eugenie Diserio, another of the 4 core members of the band, as well as talk a little bit more about the history of Model Citizens, look at some of the live reviews that were published during the year or so that the band was going. So thank you to everyone who listened, and again, part 2 will continue our foray into the history of Model Citizens.